If I had a penny for each main protagonist that's a thief, I'd have 4 pennies, which is not much, but it is pretty cool that it's happened 4 times. The Thief is a job that's pretty much been with us since day one, first appearing in Final Fantasy I and almost every subsequent game after that, with a couple exceptions. Probably best known for possessing the steal or mug commands, thieves are pretty plucky and fast characters and make up some of the most beloved characters in the franchise. I'm no fashion expert, but I do like looking at the character designs of my favorite games, so today we're going to be looking at my personal favorite job, the Thief. Before we begin, I want to let you know that my criteria to consider somebody a thief character was somebody who possessed the mug or steal commands. So this includes like bandits, ninjas, thieves, and of course treasure hunters. I think all of these classes slash jobs are all kind of thief adjacent and definitely qualified to be discussed together. Unfortunately, I have also not played all of these games yet, so if there's something that's like in context to the world that the character lives in that I seem to just not have mentioned, I apologize that I maybe glossed over some important stuff. By the way, I'm going to be looking at every single character design on my side screen over here. Starting off with Final Fantasy I is the very first iteration of the Thief Ninja job. So this character design really establishes green as the thief color, and we can see in the thief design there's a lot of medieval design influence. We have like a long green tunic and leather shoes and belts, and I feel like tunics are really like staple medieval piece of clothing. But then there's kind of like this bandana that really changes the design and makes the character feel more like youthful and mischievous, which is something that is really characteristic of thief characters in the franchise. I also think that it's a little bit like Robin Hood inspired with like the green colors and the belts. And Robin Hood is a really like famous plucky outlaw, so I think his personality might have been like a archetype that they kind of followed for future characters. And then the thief upgrades into the ninja, and I think what they did with the ninja was really interesting. The ninja is kind of an introduction to this more like overarching Arabian influence that we're gonna get. The hat is a lot like a ninja hood, but it's also kind of feeling like keffiyeh inspired, and we're gonna see that in like future designs as well, so keep that in mind. And these character designs are credited to Amano for doing kind of the concept art, but a lot of the work was also done by Koichi Ishii for doing the character models. The next character we're going to discuss is from none other than Final Fantasy II, and that is Paul. So Paul is kind of like a pseudo thief. I don't really think that many people see him as a thief, but he is technically a thief because he has the steal command, so I'm going to treat him as such. And I think that Paul is one of the most, if not the most, interesting design that I looked at today. I think he is super awesome, so let's get into it. So Paul is rocking this like bowl cut. It was a popular haircut in Europe in the Middle Ages, and it was popularized by Henry V, and it is kind of an alternate of the friar haircut of kind of religious men. And that makes me wonder if they kind of named him after Paul the Apostle. I feel like his outfit is really biblical reminiscent if you look at it. He has like this medieval chestplate and arm guards that kind of change the tone and make him a little bit more like militant and more kind of like a fighter in a fantasy game. And then he also has these really interesting foot wraps on called waraji, and they were worn by samurais. And I think that's something that kind of like comes together to make him a bit more militant. To go on to his main outfit, he's wearing this white tunic with red adornments on the bottoms and hems and a stole cape, and it's really reminiscent of Moorish Arab soldiers. So I think this is like the expansion that we saw in the first game from the kind of like little bit of Arabian influence that we saw. I really like the direction they took with Paul. And the stole that he's wearing is really interesting because purple is rarely seen in medieval Europe. So I think it would be really easy to write him off as like a, biblical kind of character design. But the incorporation of the purple really makes me feel like it definitely is Arabian influence, because this color, probably Tyrian purple, was really, really, really expensive to get in Europe. But purple was really common in Morocco since their Atlantic coastline was kind of a hub for the snails that produce that dye. So it wasn't so inaccessible there. So that kind of solidifies that influence for me personally. I really love the combination of like medieval European and Arabian influences. This is something really like unique and special to the Final Fantasy series, and it's something that I think is like wildly successful. The team like really did something when they thought about that. Also, as a little side note, I want to mention that I think it's really cool that in the beginning, in the original Final Fantasy II game, Paul appeared with a ninja sprite that didn't exactly match his portrait. And then later on, they edited him to be more accurate to Amano's original artwork. As you could imagine, the character design for Paul is accredited to Yoshitaka Amano. In Final Fantasy III, we have the simple but loved Thief class. This is not fashion related, but I think it's really cool that Final Fantasy III was the first game to introduce the iconic steal command to the Thief class. This design is really reminiscent to the Final Fantasy I Thief. It kind of keeps the green motif, they have the bandanas, but I really like that they chose a direction that every character would have a little bit of a different design. I think that brought like a lot of unique flavor to the game. It's definitely really youthful and playful again in comparison to Final Fantasy II. We kind of moved away from the playfulness with Paul, but I think this brings us back to like the plucky thief in Final Fantasy I. That's not to say that Paul is not kind of a plucky and interesting guy, but I think his design is a lot more serious than these two. And this one is also a lot more piratey, and that is something that I want you to remember because that is like something that they're gonna run with. They have these cropped pants and bandanas and kind of like flowy white pirate shirts, and cloth waist sashes were something really popular in pirate fashion. And I think it is definitely in line with the original established thief class, like I said from the first game. I think it kind of just was like a like building upon that one. Like I mentioned before, I want you guys to remember this design because I feel like a lot of the following games took inspiration from Final Fantasy III. And the job designs in this game are accredited to Koichi Ishii again. Next is Final Fantasy IV's Edge, and I think this design is epic. I think they completely started doing something new in Final Fantasy IV. It is really, really, really interesting to me. I think it's a great example of how intertwined the ninja and thief classes are. Edge is the first ninja that we're going to be looking at, and right off the bat, there is so much Persian and Moorish inspiration and influence here for me. He's wearing these really epic, like gray, purple capes and scarves, and there's super fantastical yellow, red, and purple embellishments that makes me feel like there is a definite Persian influence here. Historical Persian fashion is really known for like the vibrant colors and intricate patterns and flowy fabrics, so that is really cool to me. I think they did a lot of research when designing this character. And I think this really removes Edge from the more traditional European-inspired thief ninja designs that we got previously. He has a lot of beaded jewelry and fringes on his ears and his waist, and I think that really elevates the design into something magically unique. I think the other designs previously didn't have so much embellishment and like, I hate to say, but kind of like not needed elements, like things that were just like frivolous, but I think that Edge's design is super frivolous. I think it kind of falls in line with who he is as a character, but I think it also was like them playing around with more interesting and unique designs. I think that Edge was really the start of a long era of thieves with excessive amount of sashes and belts and pouches that I really am a fan of personally. And the character design for Edge is credited to Yoshitaka Amano. Next up, we have Final Fantasy V with the Thief class, and this really brings us back to the Final Fantasy 1 and 3 Thief classes. I think it really falls into the same archetype, and they wanted to do kind of something similar to those games. They kept the classic Thief green color, and we have the similar brown belts and boots like we had in Final Fantasy 1. But I also really love that every character has slightly different outfits to match their personality, which is something that we first saw developed in Final Fantasy III. And this design brought back the fun classic bandana headscarf, except this time every character is wearing it in a little bit of a unique way. I think in the setting of this game, giving the characters more subtle differences between them really helped characterize them and really give them unique personalities, even though they were so limited. In comparison to the last two games, overall, I feel like these designs are less bohemian and piratey and more like medieval fantasy, so I think they kind of took a little shift back to the original concept of the Final Fantasy games. And these character designs were originally conceptualized by Yoshitaka Amano and then had some work done on them by Kazuko Shibuya. The next game is Final Fantasy VI, and before we continue, I want to clarify that our boy Locke is not a thief, he's a treasure hunter. You got that? There's a difference, okay? I think Final Fantasy VI is really the beginning of an iconic era for thief character designs. I think that Locke's design really builds upon all of the elements of past designs in a really fresh and more modern way. While Locke has the classic thief bandana, There is also a really heavy Arabian influence that we don't really see in the designs that do have a bandana. And I think it really reminds me more of like Final Fantasy IV Edge's design, but with a bit more of a modern twist with like combat boots and more like tactical pants. And I think we're really like shifting into the golden age in general of Final Fantasy designs, not just with Thieves. And they're kind of moving away from the more like orthodox, safe fantasy concept and kind of developing their own kind of like special idea of what fantasy means for their game series. See Locke sporting these dual daggers called kumyas, I believe that's what they're called, and they are a dagger of the Arabian Moors of Morocco, so I think that that Arabian influence is really tied in by his weapon choice, but we can also see it with all of the sashes on his waist and the kind of like embellishments and really interesting patterns that he has going on. He has these bright reds, yellows, purples, and that really feels like Persian again to me. Really fun. It's like, I don't know, it's just like this modern interpretation. When like in the earlier games, we kind of got something more like historical feeling, while Locke kind of feels like more modern with these really cool historic and cultural like embellishments on his base outfit. And he has earrings and necklaces and jewelry and beads, and I think it's just like a really like comprehensive character. Like I think he really feels consistent throughout the whole outfit. And he also has like a more modern jacket with short sleeves and like the combat boots and tactical pants, like I said. And I think that this really kind of helped the characters feel more relatable to a modern audience. I think like, you know, like I said in the past games, they were more like, they kind of felt like historical figures and not so much like people we could relate to. In Final Fantasy VI and like the games following, I think we kind of started to feel like we could relate to the characters more, like people we could understand. And I think fashion is a really big mode of communication to kind of get feelings across between audience and characters. I think that fashion is really overlooked sometimes. It's just like a cool, sometimes maybe silly and meaningless like aspect, but I think it's really a big part of what, you know, enables us to feel for a character, understand who they are, where they come from. I feel like Locke's outfit is a really great representation of his personality. It's kind of like militant and uniform, which kind of shows that he's can be a serious guy, but then I think that all of the like embellishments and kind of like, you know, unneeded quirky aspects kind of show us another side of him that we like don't even need to hear him talk or read him talk to understand. And this character design, if you couldn't tell, is also accredited to Yoshitaka Amano. If you couldn't guess already, the next game that we're going to talk about is Final Fantasy VII with the iconic Yuffie, the Master Materia Thief. I really feel like Locke was a stepping stone into a more modern direction that was fully taken with Yuffie. I really like that Yuffie is wearing the characteristic green thief outfit on her like little turtleneck sweater crop top. I love that it's green. It feels like a really nice callback and kind of like an homage to the job system. I think that's a really cool design element, and I think it's cool that they did that personally. And then she also has a lot of like strappy belts on her body and this weird like arm guard thing. I'm not even gonna like attempt to analyze that. I think it's been baffling people for generations. But besides that, she has a lot of strappy armor and kind of like a leg garter, and she has a little leg pouch. And I think that pouches are personally my favorite thief element, and I'm really glad to announce that we will be seeing more pouches from these designs onwards. Yuffie is definitely a more industrial design, but that also kind of reflects like Final Fantasy VII as a game. They live in a more like dystopian kind of industrial society, so I think she's just a product of that. But I'm glad that they were not like hesitant to take a different direction and kind of do something different with the character. I think they did a great job grounding the character design and everything that they've kind of established in the past, because Final Fantasy VII is like such a different game than everything that they've done before. I think they really successfully kind of tied it in and made her still feel like a thief ninja. I believe Final Fantasy VII is the first game that he worked on, and Yuffie's character design is credited to Tetsuo Nomura. Before we go any further, I think that we should discuss something really important: belts. Now, not just any belts, but specifically belts with no function. These seemingly functionless belts are something really popular in Thief designs and something that we're going to see a lot more coming on now. And for some reason, everyone hates them, and I'm not really sure why. Personally, I think they're really cool. Like, fashion doesn't have to make sense. Like, it's not the purpose to make sense. I think something visually interesting is really important when making a character design, and I think that if it lacks functionality, that's fine, it's fun. Sometimes the purpose of something is not only to be functional, it's just to be interesting and fun and something like stimulating to look at. I don't think it really makes sense to compare it to something that's supposed to be logical and practical. Like, it's a fantasy video game, it's not supposed to be practical and logical, but that's just me. If you don't like it, I mean, if you're having an aneurysm on Reddit every single time you see a thread about Nomura and his belt designs, then like, you need to learn to have some fun, man. Like, come on. It's okay, we forgive you. It's never too late to start having fun. Now can be the moment for you. That being said, let's go take a look at some belts. Before we move on to the next game though, I want to mention that unfortunately we can't talk about Final Fantasy VIII just because there is no like job or class system in that game, and I also feel like there's just not really like a single character that embodies a thief or kind of feels thief adjacent at all. So we will be moving on to the next game. The next character design we're going to be taking a look at is Final Fantasy IX Zidane. Zidane? I say Zidane. And he is probably my favorite thief and arguably probably one of my favorite Final Fantasy characters of all time. I think in general, Final Fantasy IX was a really big callback to the original Final Fantasy games, and I think we really see that in Zidane's outfit. It feels very medieval inspired, and it kind of is like a shift of direction after 7 and 8 that was just really different for the series in general, and I think 9 just really brings it back really nicely. Sleeveless tops and vests are a pretty common element in most of the designs, and we get that here too with Zidane. But he has this really unique like layered belt design and these shoulder straps that kind of like a holster in the back. And I love these belts. I know that they don't make any sense, but I think they're really cool. I think it adds, like, just take that, like, just imagine the belt wasn't there. The design just wouldn't be the same. So Zidane doesn't really have a pouch, but he does have like this gun sword holster that kind of serves the same design purpose as a pouch. So I think that, you know, works perfectly fine. During the Renaissance, blue was often the color of choice when painting the Virgin Mary, and it kind of became a sign of like purity, humility, and the divine. And I think that this color choice for Zidane is really great. Even though we meet Zidane in the beginning of the game and he's established as like a poor thief, he really dresses quite like royal, and I think this kind of like alludes to some story stuff later on. But I love this detail, and I don't know if it was intentional, but I think because the game is so like medieval inspired, I like want to believe that this is true. Blue was a really like divine color at that time and a little bit expensive, so I think that they put him in this to kind of elevate his design, even though he's supposed to be like a poor thief. Even though there's no green in this outfit and they kind of swapped it out for blue, I think it is still so much like a Final Fantasy thief. Like, even though green is omitted, I would not doubt that he is a thief character personally. I think that everything they did with it really made it feel cohesive, and I really attribute this to all of like the straps and the crops, vests, and shirts and everything. Something about him just really says thief, even though there is no green there. Last but not least, I think that the most interesting aspect of Zidane's outfit is the jabot and matching cuffs that he's wearing. Jabots were originally worn in Europe in the 17th century, and generally they had matching cuffs attached to the dress shirt. But considering that Zidane has no sleeves, they kind of gave him like wrist cuffs to attach like the lace detailing to. So that was pretty clever in my opinion. And I think this is a really awesome like medieval kind of like high class element. I don't know, I just think it's really cool. I like all of the medieval Europe inspiration. And I think the jabot really just like ties it all together and makes it feel like super awesome. Zidane's character design is credited to Toshiyuki Idahana and some work done by Shuko Murase. Before we move on, I also want to talk about Blank, Marcus, and Cinna. I know that they're not main characters, but they are thieves in Final Fantasy IX, and I don't have much to say about them just because they are kind of like scantily clad. They're not really wearing much, but they do have a bunch of like strappy belts and like wrist cuffs, and that's just like a really thief thing to me. Like, they all kind of have like a belt on their torso and then on their wrists and their feet and everything, and that just really says thief to me, and it's just a bunch of belts, and I think they're pretty cool character designs. I don't really have much to say about them because they're not really wearing enough to be inspired by anything, but yeah, I don't want to just like gloss over them because they're really cool guys. The next game we're going to be talking about is Final Fantasy X's Riku. So first I want to acknowledge like her green shorts and the bootstraps. I feel like this is a nod to the classic thief green that Nomura also did with Yuffie's design and her like sweater. So I think Nomura is really like giving a nod to the classic designs. So while Riku's design is quite industrial and modernized, I really appreciate the Polynesian and tropical influences that's really relevant to the title. Final Fantasy X kind of takes place in a tropical world. So her green shorts with the frills kind of remind me of like grass fiber skirts, but they're kind of like, you know, pleated. And that's seen in a lot of Polynesian cultures. I think that Riku's character design kind of combines thief elements with the unique all-bed fashion that we see in Final Fantasy X, and it makes a design that's really relevant to the game, but still like successfully identifiable as a thief, at least in my opinion. If you're not familiar with Final Fantasy X, all beds are a race of people, and they're kind of like tropical steampunk people, and I really want to make a video about them in the future, so let me know if you would be interested in seeing that. Riku's hair kind of feels somewhat inspired by Tahitian headpieces. It's like frilly and sticking up, and it's kind of just a guess, but I think that it reminds me of like the flowers and grasses sticking up at their headpieces. But I also think that probably more accurately, she has a clear Gyaru inspiration. So if you're not familiar with Gyaru, Gyaru is basically a fashion subculture that originated in Japan and kind of like peaked in the 90s and like early 2000s. Gyaru is a like Japanese loan word kind of representing the American slang for gal. And it's kind of characterized by like blonde, light hair and dark tan skin with bold colors and heavy makeup, and generally just like a fun, like happy vibe. And I think we definitely see that with Riku. I also see a lot of girls in Gyaru fashion with something called Yaiba, which is a snaggletooth of the canines, and Riku also has that design element. I think that the Gyaru fashion kind of inspired Riku's hair, makeup, and face model a bit. Interestingly, Riku also has feathers in her braids and on her bootstraps, and that kind of reminds me of Final Fantasy III's Edge with like his like beads and feathers and fringe. And I also think that this kind of like provides some looseness and mischievousness that we got in the past thieves. It kind of provides like some flow to the outfit. Riku also has like these flowing blue straps on the back of her design, and I think the blue probably represents her high status since she is the daughter of the Albed faction leader. That's just a guess. It's kind of like Zidane and his wearing blue. I think they kind of do that with Riku too. I don't know, kind of seems like that way to me. Riku has, of course, straps and belts and kind of like an arm guard that's reminiscent of Yuffie's, and overall I think Riku is a really fun and unique thief design. And her design is credited to Tetsuro Nomura again. That's not all we're going to see of Riku, because the next game we're talking about is Final Fantasy X-2, and Riku comes back a little bit different and a little bit older, this time with Yuna and Pain by her side. The main thief of this game is Riku, so we're going to be mostly focusing on her, but this game has something called a dress sphere system where every character changes outfit depending on the dress sphere equipped. So Yuna and Pain both also do have thief outfits, so to go over those pretty quickly, I don't really find either of them to be too characteristic for thieves in the Final Fantasy theories, and honestly it's kind of always thrown me off. But what I do think that they did is they kind of tried to make like bikini outfits for them, because Riku is kind of wearing like a beach outfit. So I think they tried to take like a Polynesian inspiration and kind of put Yuna and Pain also in kind of like beachy outfits, but still try and make them feel like they're a character. Like Pain is wearing a bit more clothes, a little bit more covered up than the other characters because she's a bit more of a conservative character. And Yuna is kind of wearing like a frilly skirt that's like blue and white and red, and she kind of like looks like a flower to me. So I think they kind of took some Polynesian inspiration with them. I think Riku's design in X-2 is a really like beachy and sunny iteration of the classic thief elements. I think they continue with the Gyaru inspiration like way more with her hair now. It's a lot more crazy and I love it. I think it looks really great. And she is a lot more saturated. She's got like bright yellows and oranges and reds, and she has these awesome waist pouches and loads of like girly strappy details and bows. Kind of similar to Blank, Cinna, and Marcus in Final Fantasy IX, the girls are pretty scantily clad, but I think it works really well. Personally, I think that it is a great thief design. She has beads in her hair that kind of remind me of the earlier designs where you had some jewelry. In the first game, Riku had blue in her outfit and they didn't get rid of it. She also has a blue bandana on her head now, which I think is still like a nod to her kind of high class position in society. And again, these character designs are credited to Tetsuo Nomura. This next title takes a trip back to the classic games and brings back the thief class, and that is Final Fantasy XI. This design has the classic thief green as a really prominent element, and I love the callback to the classic games. The headdress is kind of a mix between Arab keffiyeh and a like Japanese soldier field cap, and I think it's really interesting. I love the headpiece in this design, and it is also basically an exact replica of the Final Fantasy I ninja headdress. And I think that's a really cool callback since this is their first MMO game and they wanted to kind of maybe like give a nod to the very first Final Fantasy game. And there is also the inclusion of the more modernly implemented waist pouches and strappy belts and arm guards. So I think it's a really good mix of like the original games with some new design elements they came up and they kind of mashed them together and made something that feels like a classic and also modern Final Fantasy thief. The wide vest collar kind of reminds me of the Final Fantasy Thief's white shirt collar and also kind of like Locke's jacket in Final Fantasy VI. So I think they must have took inspiration from there. This character design kind of has like cropped harem pants, and I feel like this kind of goes back to like the more bohemian and piratey designs, and I think that's something that we're going to see in the next game too. So I think that was like the beginning of a little shift back to what we saw in like Final Fantasy III. I had a little bit of a hard time figuring out who the character designer was for this game, but I do know that Tetsuya Nomura did play a role in these designs. Next up, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy XII's Vaughn, and his goal is basically to become a rich sky pirate, essentially, and I think that his design really reflects this. Again, like in 11, it kind of brings us back to some of the early Arabian and Moorish design elements. They definitely took a like pirate direction, but we still have a lot of like strappy elements and a cropped vest and a waist sash. So I like appreciate the bohemian, but also kind of like industrial combination they did here. I hate to say it, but he's kind of wearing like the stereotypical Aladdin Arabian cropped vest, but I think it really works to make him feel like whimsical and youthful and kind of fun and like a thief. I do believe that Vaughn was probably inspired by Barbary Corsairs, which are like Ottoman pirates. He has this sash around his waist, which is kind of like his fill-in for a belt, and it's used to hold items for pirates, but it was also a status symbol for them to have red sashes since red was an expensive color and used to flaunt wealth. So I think this is kind of like showing that Vaughn wants to be rich and he's trying to like give this good image of himself. So I think it's a really like interesting thing that it says about the character. It could also be signaling him as the main character of the game since red was often worn by sergeants, so that can kind of like bring importance to Vaughn. This design also kind of brings me back to Final Fantasy III's Edge in his waist sash. I find Vaughn's pants really interesting. They have like this interesting pattern and these like kind of like silver embellishments on them and these like bellowing side panels that kind of like add flow and kind of like a bohemian energy. But all the metal makes him feel like very industrial, which I think is a good reflection of like the society and world that he lives in. I think it like elevates it more than just like an Ottoman pirate, but like a fully fledged fantastical sky pirate. I think that this is a really cool design and kind of incorporates things that we saw in a lot of games in a like really unique and different way. Vaughn's character design is credited to Akihiko Yoshida. Next, we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy XIII, specifically Lightning Returns, since the other two Final Fantasy XIII games don't really have a thief. This game doesn't really have a thief either, but similar to Final Fantasy X's Dress Fear system, this game has a garb system, and Lightning has something called the Heartstealer outfit, which is essentially a thief. It's claimed that the character designer Toshiyuki Idahana was inspired by Yoshitaka Amano's design for Final Fantasy VI's Locke. And I think we definitely see that here with this garb. I think the embellishments are a little bit more like Vaughn and a little bit less like Locke. I think it's more piratey and more Spanish, kind of like Vaughn, but I feel like the base is still Locke. She has waist sashes and belts and a similar jacket to Locke, but more cropped and more feminine. There's unfortunately not much information on the creation of the garbs for this game, so there's not much that I can say definitely, but just from my own research and opinion, I do feel like this is like a Latin twist on the more Arabian design of Locke. It's a lot more slim and less like industrial and combat looking. It's a lot more feminine. And I also think that because Lightning Returns was released in 2013, I think it really reflects like the awkward 2013 layering phase where we kind of like put clothes on top of each other that like didn't really match. But overall, I think it's a cool and fun design. I do feel like this design is kind of lacking. I don't really feel like there's much that I can say from like a historical standpoint. But I think that's maybe just like the nature of the game because there are so many garbs and Lightning Returns. I think it's difficult to make every single outfit like outstandingly unique and amazing, but I still think it's a great outfit. It was kind of hard to find information about the designer for this game, but I do know that Tetsuya Nomura worked on some of the character designs for Final Fantasy XIII, and I do believe the costume designer was Toshiyuki Idahana, but I'm not exactly sure. The next and last game on our list is Final Fantasy XIV's Rogue/Thief class. Since Final Fantasy 15 and 16 don't really have distinctive thieves, this is the last game that we're going to be talking about. I mentioned much earlier in the video to keep Final Fantasy III's character designs in mind, and this is why. I think that the Thief class in this game is a modern version of that design, essentially. I think that there's a lot of parallels between the two of them, and I think it's really cool. I think it's like a much more piratey version of Final Fantasy III with the similar cropped pants, a white shirt, just a little bit more different, arguably more piratey. The bandanas, jewelry. Overall, I think it's just kind of like an homage to that game. There's an obvious pirate influence for this design. The guild master is called Jack Swallow, and if you're familiar with the Pirates of the Caribbean, you would know Captain Jack Sparrow. So that is definitely like a little callback to that, which I think is honestly kind of fun. There's not really much to say about this design other than it's really like relevant to the Final Fantasy XIV world, and it's piratey. Yeah, I think a good theme of this video is just that pirates are really cool. So this is my interpretation of the character designs of all of the mainline Final Fantasy Thief characters. Let me know your guys' favorite thieves or if I missed anything, and let me know if you would like to see more videos like this for other classes in the Final Fantasy games. Thanks for watching. Bye!